Hello and welcome to another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. Once again, from blasting around the country lanes in very valuable Lamborghinis, we come slightly more down to earth, but still with something very interesting, the Mercedes W107, the Wagen 107. Here it's the Roadster, the R107, and they made the coupe, the longer wheelbase car, the C107. And this car, they made so many of them, they made 300,000 of these cars over 18 years, which is a fantastic amount for a sports car, very sort of niche car really. And 2/3 of those went to the US. And if I think back to the 1970s, the early 80s, when as a kid I used to watch all the American TV series and Heart to Heart, Dallas, Columbo. The Roadster in particular, the R107, was the absolute epitome of success and wealth, really. And everybody who was anybody drove around in one of these. Beverly Hills Cop, the first movie, had one prominently in that. And they, with good reason, they were a great car. They were based on the underpinnings of a Mercedes from the 1960s, incredibly enough, the W114, which came out in 1968, the sort of mid-range saloon. It would be the E-Class now, I would guess, in modern terms. So they used that right the way through. The basic chassis, they of course developed it along the way, but they stopped making these in 1989. As I say, an 18-year production run, which is a great testimony to how right they got it first time. The early cars suffered with corrosion quite considerably. Mercedes used a plastic skin that they sprayed on the underneath of the car. It was white and then covered with a film of black to make it look less obvious. And what happened was the plastic skin would eventually split with stone chips or a jack being used to jack it up in the wrong way or something like that. Once it split, moisture got underneath the skin and the thing just rusted away inside quietly without hardly anybody knowing about it. The sills were a common area of rust on them. The front inner wings here, just under the hood, the bonnet at the front here, dirt and moisture used to gather there and rust them from the inside out. And the bulkhead was a big rust problem as well. Water drainage, lack of it, used to gather in the bulkhead. Battery is placed there, battery acid leaked down. And they did improve this, and they started to galvanize the bodies from the early 1980s, which made a big difference. But nevertheless, all these things notwithstanding, a great car. They gave the engine an update in the late 70s, the V8 engine. They took it from an iron block V8 to an alloy V8. When they first did that in 1981, it was a bit of a mess, the engine actually, temporarily. They used various design flaws in the engine, single row timing chain. And they also got the, very unusually from Mercedes-Benz, and I know this from personal experience because I had a 380 SLC, a customer with one, they got the bore to stroke ratio wrong on the pistons on the very early 3.8s, and they used to wear out and burn oil prematurely. And after 18 months, they altered the bore to stroke ratio, and from then on, right through the 1980s, all the V8 engines, the 380, the 500, and the 560 were okay. They'd go on to big mileages. Mercedes insist on using phosphor bronze valve guides in their engines, which are very soft and wear. If you do a top-end overhaul on a Merc engine from that sort of era, the exhaust valves and the inlet valves will have a lot of play in them when you strip the cylinder heads down. This is quite normal for Mercedes. I remember in the early 90s, I took the cylinder head off a Jaguar AJ6 engine, a 4-litre, that had done 100,000 miles. And it used cast iron valve guides, and there was no play in the inlet or exhaust valves after 100,000 miles. So Mercedes didn't always get it right, but they did get a lot right, more than most other manufacturers, really. This is the sort of sweet spot of the W126 range. This is a 500 SL Euro spec car. This is a British car, it's right-hand drive. This car is actually all original. It's never been restored. It's never had any paintwork. Every last piece of this car, apart from normal service items, is factory original. And the car's done 23,000 miles from new, still with its original owner who bought it brand new. Really lovely car. It's now 36 years old and it's wearing its years very well. It's got almost every factory option on this car. The smoke silver paintwork, which is one of the best colour schemes. It was a staple of Mercedes right the way through to, I think Smoke Silver was around for 30 years, something like that. It's got the Brazilian hat alloy wheels, as they were called, which people with time think those chrome Mercedes hubcaps are very agreeable, which they are. But for me, these fantastic alloy wheels, which are a factory optional extra, really do set these cars off very well. In 1982, they did make one update to the engine. They went for what was called at the time the Energy Concept. And what they did was they used ultrasonics in the induction system of the engine for the first time to actually atomize the fuel in the engine successfully. And it made a huge difference, that with a couple of other things, changing the gearing. Literally, they got sort of nearly 25% better fuel consumption just at a stroke by doing that. Incredibly clever, really. And a lot of modern cars have followed suit. They use ultrasonics in the inlet system as well. This engine, as I say, it had its problems when it came out in the very early 80s, but once they'd got those ironed out, Mercedes really dropped the ball with engine design in the early 80s. The Mercedes 190 engine was a bit of a catastrophe as well. It had a single row timing chain, used to have to change those every 30,000 miles as a service item. No excuse for that, really. They went on to the obvious later modification, which was to put a duplex chain back on them again, as they should have had from the start. But we forgive them a few mistakes along the way, because these are great cars. So I'm going to explain about the induction system, why they could suddenly win 25% less fuel consumption at a stroke. This car hasn't been valeted. All the cars that I do videos about are simply as they come in and as we do work on them. This is a working workshop. This is a working business every day. And if I do seize the opportunity to do a video on a car, it probably hasn't been valeted or detailed to the nth degree, because it's part of my working day. It's part of my working life. We just take these cars aside, we do a video on them. We don't particularly forward plan necessarily. It's just as the chips fall and as the opportunity presents itself. So the engine compartment is grubby, but I'm going to take the air filter off and just delve into a little bit about what made these cars so smooth and so powerful and so comparatively economical. When the US went into sort of major emissions mode in the 70s and 80s, they were sort of dark years for the American car consumer, the 70s and 80s, because increasingly stringent government regulations, particularly in California. On the one hand, they were saying we want cars to use less fuel, but on the other, they were saying we want them to be less environmentally damaging as well. And it was a very difficult compromise to strike. American auto manufacturers struggled really with horrendously complicated carburetors on their engines to try and keep all the plates spinning with regards to fuel consumption and emissions and everything else, and poor quality unleaded fuel. The Mercedes fared rather better because they were sort of ahead of the curve already with fuel injection and more emission systems, but even Mercedes struggled in the late 80s. And what they did was brought out a model called the 560 SL, which was initially just for the American market. It eventually ended up in Japan as well, but the whole reason they brought the 560 out was to compensate for increasing emissions problems and fuel consumption problems. So they took the engine out to 5.6 litre, as the name suggests. It sounds very impressive, but actually they weren't as powerful or as potent as the 500 European versions. So this is the fastest and most pokey of the lot of them, really, the 500 SL Euro spec. I remember I was shocked when I actually drove a US spec car. I was on a singing engagement in the southern states of the US. I flew over there and my host picked me up from the airport in a Mercedes 420 SE, which was his car. 4.2 version of this engine. I'd driven plenty of 420 SEs over here, and his car just drove like somebody had put a tennis ball in the exhaust system. It was terrible, and that's how they were. We didn't know we were born in Europe with these beautifully smooth, powerful cars. This 500 develops 245 brake horsepower, I think, so it's not quite 50 brake horsepower a litre, which is very low tuned, but it does the job very well. It hauls this car along very well. There are one or two particular things that I like about the 107. One of them is the way the doors close. They called this car, when they first conceived it, it was a sort of standing joke in Mercedes. They called it the Panzerwagen. In other words, the tank, the Panther tank car, because it was so over-engineered bodywork-wise, particularly the structure. And you'll see later when I drive it, there's no scuttle shake on this car. There's no shaking of the steering wheel when you go over a bump, as you normally get in a lot of roadsters. Very, very strong car. And the doors are like bank vaults. So I'll just show you. If you just close the door, clunk. And even the door handle is a beautifully engineered item. It's actually got bob weights on the back of it that turn when you pull the handle, and it can actually gives you that feel, that real quality feel, which you can't do without extremely obsessive engineering. To engineer a door handle to feel weighty as you open it, but smooth and light. I mean, just really, really obsessive engineering. And car manufacturers have got this far more licked now than they had years ago. They can build in quality to even fairly cheap cars by putting sound insulating panels on the doors so that they sound right when you close them and things like this. But you can't replicate this. I'm just going to do it again. Clunk. I'm going to do a sort of buyer's guide to these cars as well. So if you are in the market to treat yourself, the car you've always promised yourself, I think a car manufacturer used that as a strapline some years ago actually, but I can't remember who it was. Then I'm going to sort of point out a couple of things that, that you should be looking for when you buy, as well as to protect your long-term investment. One of the things that's very recognisable on the W107, whether it's the R107, the Roadster, or the C107, is the door trim architecture. And they have you had various types of interior trim on the 107. You had the MB checked cloth, you had the Tex, which was like the vinyl, or you had leather, or you had velour. There were 4 different types of interior material that you could have on these cars. This car's got factory leather because it's a high-spec car. So what Mercedes do is it looks like leather. It isn't actually. It's perforated Tex vinyl, but it's welded into the door trim here and here. And bearing in mind the youngest, as I mention this now, the youngest 107 is 31 years old now. How these have fared is very, very, very telling for the car's history. Lots of people replace these. That you can count the number of people in the world who can replicate this welding, this welting, on one hand. Very, very few people get this right. And to see this on a car now, a 107, is very, very unusual, the original door trim. It's quite nicely done, but it gives some idea as to the life the car's had. Has it been pampered, or has it been subject to a lot of UV light, cracked dashboard tops, door trims, things like that? Or is it like this car where it's been remarkably well preserved and time warp looked after? Something else to bear in mind on them is the play in the steering. The steering is quite an antiquated system on this car. It's a recirculating ball steering system, not a rack and pinion. And you can actually adjust the steering box on these cars for play as you drive them, as you park, put pressure on the steering box. They wear inside a bit, which is quite normal. In my experience, 60, 70,000 miles on a 107, you need to be adjusting the steering box because there's too much play in it. It feels too slack at the tiller. It's done with a 5mm Allen key under the bonnet. You can just get at it with everything in situ. And usually you have to unscrew the screw to take up the clearance, not screw it in as you do on a normal steering box, just a Mercedes quirk. But it does transform the steering. It doesn't need doing on this car because it's done such a low mileage, 23,000 miles. But a lot of 107s, you can really make a difference. Don't over adjust it, but you can make a big difference to the way the car drives just by readjusting the steering box on them. let's have a look at the fuel injection system. Let's have a look at the engine. Yeah, so we're going to take the air filter off the middle here. The air filter's situated inside here. Here's the air intake. On the Euro spec 560s, the 560 SEL and the 560 SEC, the 126 series, they were up to 300 brake horsepower because they weren't particularly bothered about emissions problems. And they actually had two intakes. That's how you can tell a 560 under the hood, under the bonnet quickly. Because they flowed more air, so they needed a second air intake. But this is still the most powerful 107, so we just pull all this off carefully. One of the reasons why this engine is so grubby is the fact that Mercedes-Benz sprayed a protective wax on them from the factory, this wax here, and this engine has never been detailed or valeted. Yeah. Not great, but it means that the original wax is still on there from 1984, which is quite quaint, really, in its own way. So here we have this, what looks like a mechanical tarantula in the middle here. This is called the fuel distributor or fuel metering head. And Bosch very cleverly, and this is the sort of thing that only a budget of millions of pounds of research and development can do, really, but Bosch discovered in the early 70s that this type of injection system could work. It's what's called a constant injection system, CIS. So you've got a flap here, which the engine sucks the air in. This is the throttle down here underneath. The throttle plate is down there. The engine sucks all its air in through this flap, which has a pivot, and then there is a needle working in the middle of this to, it's literally immersed in high pressure fuel, and it meters the fuel out to these 8 pipes, to the 8 injectors, one for each cylinder. But they're actually working all the time. This is where Bosch's cleverness comes in. They realised that for the emissions requirements and power requirements of the period, it didn't actually matter whether the injection was sequential, i.e. before that cylinder's about to fire, it gets an injection of petrol, so it sucks it in. They realised that if it was working all the time, just slowly injecting petrol into the inlet track just before each cylinder, it didn't particularly affect exhaust emissions or power. And that's how this system works. So it's very simple. It's just a constant supply of fuel with a needle in there, no moving parts apart from the needle, that's it. And it just slowly injects a constant supply through all 8 pipes. So you've got these 2 pipes along here above the injectors. This is the idle air valve here. The system, it's called a K-Jetronic, and it uses ultrasonic high frequency air to actually atomize that constantly injected fuel efficiently. And it's all about how well the combustion process happens in the combustion chamber as to how much or how little fuel you use. And they managed to win a lot of efficiency by using this ultrasonic air to really atomize the fuel. And as I say, it instantly won them, along with a couple of other modifications, about 20% reduction in fuel consumption for any given horsepower, which is incredible, really. But the earlier system that was fitted on the very first of these V8s between 1971 and 73 was called D-Jetronic. The amusing part about this is the D-Jetronic was actually, the engine was more powerful for any given, so the 4.5 litre D-Jetronic, the 450 SL, was more powerful than the later 450 SL with K-Jetronic. Obviously, Mercedes didn't advertise the fact that their later engines were less powerful than their earlier ones. This happened with Ferrari as well, by the way. The 355, the early 355s with the Bosch 2.9 Motronic management system were more powerful than the later 355s with the Bosch Motronic 5.2. Ferrari didn't tell their customers that the later 355s were less powerful. Happens more often than you'd think. Just an interesting by curio, really. So what I'm going to do now is start the engine and let it idle. I'm also looking at this breather pipe here Just make sure that there's not too many oil vapours coming out of this pipe, because if there are, then that means the engine's got problems. It should just have a nice steady flow of vapour out of there, which would normally go into the air filter and be sucked into the engine. So we'll start it up, let it idle, and it will be as smooth as silk, this motor, I have no doubt. Yeah, you can actually hear the idle valve, the acoustics of that ultrasonic air I was talking about coming through the idle valve. We can do a close-up of the sound to let you hear that. But as you can see, the engine is beautifully smooth. It's ticking over about 500 RPM. Just lovely. This is the way they should be. Yeah, the quality of this car as a model just shines through and through and through. The solidity of the thing just oozes from every pore, really. This, as I mentioned earlier about the steering box needing adjustment, it makes all the difference on these cars. And in fact, of course, this one's only done 23,000 miles, so it doesn't need adjusting the steering box on it. And for what is really a very old technology, a recirculating ball steering, it's remarkably direct. Mercedes-Benz really did, at this time, I mean, motoring journalists complained about the size of the steering wheel, which is enormous, but they got the steering feel, weighting, and ratio between input of wheel and movement of front wheels just right, really. It was a model from which other manufacturers could follow. But the thing about it is, okay, the suspension is not the hardest in the world, we accept that, but there's no scuttle shake from this car. There's no, scuttle shake is a really, really unpleasant phenomenon in open-top cars, and it comes as a result of the fact that there's no strengthening over the roof to make the body shell work as a whole. All you've got is the floor and the centre console and the sills to keep it actually solid. And the scuttle, this area of the car, moves around in reaction to the front wheels in particular. And there's none of that on this car. It just feels like it's absolutely hewn from the solid. And being the 500 SL, the 5-litre V8, it also does go. It really does. Beautiful acceleration, really. Effortless, quiet. Those hydraulic tappets, that constant fuel injection system, all doing their thing and working together. Really, really satisfying drive still. Yeah, but one of the things about cars of this era is that they are very under-geared. We've got up to 8-speed automatic transmissions now, or thereabouts, 7, 8, 9, depending on the make and model. But this is either 3 or 4 speed, depending on the model year of the car, which means that when you're actually driving along at sort of 60, 70 miles an hour, which are legal cruising speeds in the UK, it's not as high geared as a modern car. So it's doing that's about 60, an indicated 60 miles an hour, and it's doing just under 2,000 RPM. A modern car with a big engine could easily be doing those RPM at sort of 70 plus miles an hour. And that was why these cars were so uneconomical for their time. If you were cruising in them, the engine was just working, it was revving, it wasn't under massive load, but it was revving far higher than it needed to be, and that's because they didn't make automatic gearboxes that could keep up with it. The cars of the 70s and 80s and the 60s were far too low geared at cruising speeds. They didn't have the bandwidth from a reasonable first, second and third gear to have that extra fourth or fifth gear to bring the cruising revs down. And going back to what I said earlier about the Mercedes energy concept, they did alter the gearing, but this car is actually post-energy concept. It's a later car, and it's still revving quite a lot for a given speed. Yeah, the performance of these cars is great, really. That lovely, silky smooth 5-litre engine. In this, of course, its most potent form, this V8, for the European and American markets. So we're down into first gear there, 1500 RPM. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Just a really smooth linear power curve, and this was one of the first European engines to idle at very, very low RPM. Going back to what I said earlier, they've always been a low rever, but in the 1970s, when this engine was the M116, the 350 and 450 engine, it was sort of idling in neutral at 725, 750 RPM. And then when they gradually refined it into the early 80s, the all-alloy engine, this one, the M117, the idle speed came down to sort of 550, 600 RPM, which was very low. Some American cars had idled at that, but even Rolls-Royces of the period, it took them till the late 80s, till the injection cars came out in sort of 1987, to start idling as low as that. And this car just wafts along, pick any revs you like, doesn't matter. It's really smooth and tremendously tight feeling, and just a very, very safe car. I mean, this tremendously engineered windscreen frame here, which would go some way to protecting you in a rollover situation. And yeah, she's all there. It's just lovely to drive this car still. We'll just try that 5-litre V8 performance. Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, just a linear power curve, all very relaxed, but still comes in with a 0 to 60 time in this model, the 500 SL, the Euro spec car with the sort of non-strangulated engine for emissions equipment. Still comes in at just over 7 seconds, 0 to 60. 140 mile an hour top speed, which is pretty respectable for a luxury car of this era. This car was built for crossing continents. It was built for you know, 2 people. You could have an extra 2 seats in the back as a factory optional extra, but they were next to useless unless you had kids under 10 years old or something like that. But as a sort of 2 people continent crossing luxury express, this car was hard to beat. It had comfort, good heating and ventilating system. Air conditioning wasn't as de rigueur in Europe as it is now. Even the most basic car has air conditioning now. This car doesn't, but it does have a good ventilation system. Again, this was very, very advanced when they introduced it in 1971. Face level ventilation came in the 1960s. I think the Ford Cortina was the first car to have it. But this is 1971, and this is still pretty advanced. And just a great car to cross continents with. Really, really big trunk, big boot, good fuel range. Again, fuel consumption not fantastic. What would you get out of this cruising on a run? Probably 22, 23 miles per gallon maximum, I would say. But it is of its era, and going back to the gearing, it's just not geared for economy. No cars of this period were. They still had work to do on the automatic gearbox technology to catch up. But all in all, a great drive, a great drive. Really, really enjoying driving this car. Well, that concludes another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do like, please do subscribe, please do share. It's the lifeblood of the channel, and we'll be back with something different very soon.